Kia ora tātou, nei rā te mi kia koutou e tēnei ata, mō tō tātou hui I tēnei kaupapa. So kia ora everybody, welcome to this draft gravel management strategy public feedback session. So we have already done our openings this morning in our session, so we won't do karakia now, we've already done that for today. But just checking in on apologies for the session. I know that we've got Councillor Cranwell and Councillor Diche online, and I know that Genevieve may be joining us online at 10:30 as well. Any other councillors? I know Councillor Burns is away today, so he's an apology, and Councillor Swiggs might just be for lateness as well. Oh no, you're there. Sorry, I was looking down there saying, where's Dion gone? But he's moved up here. You might want to grab your name thing too, so that'd be good. And Councillor Korako will be an apology as well, unless he joins online. And John?
And I will be an apology for this afternoon with Lincoln University graduation ceremonies.
Thank you. All good. So we'll move to our staff pre-briefing at the start to introduce the session. So we've got Lee Griffiths to come up and Jolene as well. So kia ora. Welcome up, and I'll hand over to you to introduce it. And welcome to the members of the public that are here too to give their submissions. We'll hear from you in a little while. So thank you for being here. There you go, Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just some context for today, just a reminder of how we got here, and just a few notes for how this session came about and how it will run. So Environment Canterbury has an existing gravel management strategy. It was adopted in 2012. So this process has been about updating that. The original strategy was in a completely different context post-earthquakes, and it's been 13 years. So it's well overdue an update. So over the last couple of years, we've been working with a wide range of interested parties in the community and the industry and the Rūranga to look at what we need to update in that document. And we worked very closely with Rūranga on early draft, and then it was released for full public consultation in March this year. Open for around a month. In the end, we did get some feedback that was fair, that we're a little short on the time frame, so we did extend that. We received 29 pieces of feedback in total, and 8 people have chosen to come in today to talk to their feedback. That was something that came through very strongly, that people wanted the opportunity to speak to the decision makers, so this opportunity was added in the last month or so for them to appear today. So you have been provided with the full copies of their, the 8 that are speaking, their feedback. And we will provide the full 29 copy set to you, as well as an updated version to the draft strategy post today's session. So staff have been working very carefully in the background to go through all that feedback. It is a genuine process. We will be making changes to the document post that feedback. There's been a couple of really important points raised, and some opportunities and some things we will address as well. So we will be updating the draft from what you see today, and that will then go to the Strategy and Policy Committee and to Council for hopeful adoption in June or July. Excuse me. Just a couple of reminders that you may hear things about live resource consents today, and it's quite important to protect the integrity of those processes, that they're not engaged with in that forum, although we will acknowledge the live issues. And also we have sought our own legal advice this week, and we will be making a number of small changes post that feedback, but we're very comfortable with the robust process that we've run and the good document. So what have I missed, Joe? Nothing. That's it from me. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, any questions on that overview from Lee? No, not at this stage. Cool. So I know we were planning to start a bit later, but if people are here, we could take some earlier if they are willing to. I know Nathan's here. I recognise him from the other day. Do we want to get straight into it if people are happy?
If the feedback people are happy to start, that works for us.
Cool.
But,
So we'll do a couple of minutes, so 10:25. So just get yourselves ready, and Nathan, if you're happy, we'll kick into it with you when you're ready. So come up to the table, and we'll make a start on that at 10:25. Yeah, Ian.
And I should know because I was at them all, but could you just ask the submitters if they could let us know whether they were at either one of the two gravel Hueys, one in Timaru, Ralston? I know, Nathan, you were.
Yep. All good. No worries. I mean, that could be part of the questions at the end of the submissions as well. But yeah, for people can note that.
And there were a whole lot of those.
So, kia ora, Nathan. I think you know the drill from the other day. So there's 15-minute slot for the session. But of course, if we want some questions, leave some time. But I know you're pretty efficient. I've heard you before. So yeah, hand over to you. There you go.
Kia ora, thank you. Back for the bonus round. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the effort that has gone into drafting the revised GMS, balancing the competing issues, and also acknowledge that from Marina Youth Moving's perspective, industrial feedback has been incorporated into the document, in particular the benefits provided to the community from gravel extraction. It's important to note that from an operational level, we have a very good relationship with Lee and her team. At a consenting level, there is a lot more frustration due to the inefficiencies in the process from information requirements and assessments and the costs that result from that. By comparison, the permitted activity pathway through a gravel authorisation, or GA, is cost enabling and efficient for the identical activity. While a non-statutory document, the GMS influences decisions and consenting processes. The GMS impacts gravel extraction in two ways. Firstly, whether or not gravel availability advice is issued. This is a prerequisite to being able to either apply for a GA or a resource consent. And secondly, how a GA or a resource consent is processed. Being able to obtain gravel availability is key to enabling an application to be submitted and then granted. A significant concern for Marina Youth Moving is that the GMS as drafted will sit under the Braided River Revival 100-year strategy, which is also a non-statutory document and is also still draft. By comparison, the revised GMS states that it is being prepared under the Local Government Act and with what appears to be more emphasis on the decision-making and consultation provisions of the LGA. The Braided River Revival Strategy is very much a partnership document with mana whenua and has not been subject to the more rigorous consultation that the GMS has. Due to the nexus between the two documents, we consider that the Braided River Revival Strategy should have been more widely consulted on. And unless this occurs, the GMS should sit independently of the River Revival Strategy. The linkage between the two documents raises concerns for Marina Youth Moving that the four integrated outcomes of the GMS may not be treated equally and there may be a right of veto. Marina Youth Moving has had experience where the views of individuals in key positions have resulted in council being unwilling to issue availability regardless of merit, creating supply difficulties and adding additional costs to the community need. The GMS should clearly state the views and opinions relevant to each of the outcomes and appropriately balanced, and each of the outcomes are appropriately balanced and a hierarchical approach is avoided. There are other issues raised in our feedback that are also pertinent that generally stem from the "we will" column of achieving the outcome objectives. The statement in the GMS that gravel extraction can cause sediment discharges to water. This is far too generic, lacks qualification, and does not recognise Council's Code of Practice for river gravel extraction that manages the activity to avoid this adverse effect occurring. When extraction is undertaken correctly, as per the Code of Practice, there is little or no chance of any sediment discharge occurring. The requirement for specific assessments of natural character and biodiversity. They should not be required where gravel extraction has occurred previously. The activity is short-term and is undertaken within the active riverbed. Any biodiversity that is present will have re-established following an earlier disturbance. And these matters can still be addressed by regional plans, just not as a requirement of the GMS. The proposal to integrate a requirement for cultural impact assessments into the Code of Practice. It is unclear how this requirement will benefit the river environment. This also introduces an additional layer of assessment without there being a level of disclosure that this change was proposed to be introduced. As most river beach sites have been subject to gravel extraction activities for many years, it is difficult to understand the benefit versus the cost and time implications. Community demand and territorial authority engagement. Rini Earthmoving does not consider it appropriate for gravel to be prioritised for TA road and development projects. TA requests should be prioritised the same as they are for any other contractor, as there will be competing demands for gravel in the community, such as subdivision and other construction projects. General provisions. Demonstrating lawful access. We consider that the requirement to demonstrate lawful access is a matter that stands on its own and should not be part of the GMS. Including this requirement will cause unnecessary processing delays that need not be linked to the consenting process. These can easily be addressed separately by the applicant in their own time. Duration. We would like to see the 18-month term remain for South Canterbury consents and authorisations. This has provided flexibility and aided in working around other environmental constraints, such as periods of high river flows and bird nesting season. Rini Earthmoving supports the GMS promoting a streamlined decision-making process, not to require TA consents for the same activity. Overall, we support the revised GMS and the work has been undertaken to balance the needs of all participants. It would be beneficial to see the same approach carried through into regional planning documents to enable gravel extraction within the reaches of rivers that have been identified as being salmon spawning habitat without requiring resource consent where no disturbance is occurring in the wet bed. While outside the scope of the GMS, such a change would further enhance efficiencies and benefits to the community if a gravel authorisation could be issued in such circumstances. Something to keep in mind for the future. Thank you.
Kia ora, Nathan. Thank you so much. Any questions from councillors? Yep, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan, for this. I've got a question under the point 9 that you raised in your submission in terms of integrated outcomes results in a power of veto by stealth. So I'm just wondering actually how that plays out, and if there is a veto by stealth, as you've indicated, what's the right of appeal to that? Is there a right of appeal to that, or should there be a right of appeal to that?
So there's no right of appeal. It really comes down to how the GMS influences the process, and like I've said, like getting that availability advice from council's engineering section is that's critical to move forward, and it's just in terms of those 4 outcomes, it looks like they should be treated equally, but we just want to make sure that's balanced and one doesn't outweigh the other. And so I guess what it comes down, our experience in the past is where a particular runanga have had an issue, then because of the relationship that the council has with the runanga, that has prevented the council from issuing that availability.
So is there I don't want to have a leading question of you here, but the opportunity to have that as an independent source, because the point you make here is that gravel, it may be prevented where surplus gravel or risk to property is real. So that's a concern, because the risk to property from build-ups of gravel that's been identified are concerning. So is there an opportunity to have an independent view of that outside relationships?
There could be. It just ties into that internal process that the council runs, really. So if it works efficiently, then there shouldn't be a need for that. But with all these things, the key is to be nimble and to be able to move quickly, because the river comes and the gravel comes and goes, and the flows change dramatically, and that impedes access.
Thanks, Peter. Got Councillor Cranwell. That'll come to you, Ian. Ian?
Kia ora koutou, through the chair. Two questions.
Yeah, Ian, just
Chair. First
you're a bit
one,
quiet.
Nathan.
Can you just? Sorry.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
That's better. Yeah, just two questions through the chair. First one, Nathan, just in regards to in your submission and also with your kōrero just then, benefits to the community you mentioned multiple times. Just from yourself, what are those benefits to the community?
Kia ora. I mean, those benefits are through efficient gravel extraction, because gravel is key to everything. It's used everywhere, whether that's aggregate and concrete, base course for building construction. It's used in roads. It's metal on rural roads. So at the end of the day, the end use of all that goes towards community projects, and the more difficult it is to obtain that gravel and extract it, then that adds to the cost, and so it's at the end of the day, it's the community that pays if that gravel can't be removed or used efficiently.
Kia ora, thank you for that. And just on the second one, you mentioned about cultural impact assessments and that the rivers have been, there's been gravel extraction in certain areas for multiple times, but in a sense, the Runanga are part of the community as well, so community benefit would be some extra understanding about, because maybe gravel extraction has been taken from the riverbed, but there's never been a cultural impact assessment of that area, so understanding more about local rivers would be beneficial.
Yeah, so I think it's just how that ties into the process, and whether that's something an applicant is required to obtain or not, or whether that's something the council could do in terms of wider stretches of rivers. The consents that we get for gravel extraction are short term, and they're that way for a reason, to manage the resource, and also to avoid a monopoly at certain sites. So people use different areas all the time, and so it's, I guess, if there were cultural impacts assessments, it's better to cover a much broader area than just those specific sites that contractors are applying to extract from.
Kia ora, thank you for that.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Nathan. Ian.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Going back to the discussion that you and Peter were having, the intent is to elevate the agreements with Runanga and DOC and any other agencies about where and how we should take shingle is between our Rivers Engineers team and those agencies, so that when you guys come along to ask to be able to take shingle out of any particular part, you'll have already a clear indication of what the likely answer is, whether it's a consenting process, or authorisation, or whatever. So those issues shouldn't need to go to a third party. And I note your comments, which actually are saying, make it work, please, effectively. But I mean, if we can make that system work, so you have the certainty, that would satisfy that concern of yours, would it?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yep.
Just one second question. You talk about salmon spawning sites. Have you got specific sites in mind, or it's just wherever there are specific?
So specifically, the Ope River, the Tanawai, is two good examples around Temuka, Timaru, where, because they're salmon spawning, then we can't apply for a gravel authorisation as a permitted activity. They have to go through a resource consent process, and that changes things dramatically in terms of the amount of time I have to spend preparing an application, the amount of time it takes to get the resource consent, and the cost difference is substantial. When the activity is absolutely identical as if it was done as a permitted activity, because we're not doing the activity in the wet part of the river. We're doing it exactly as we would under the code of practice. And what I've found in previous consent applications is the focus becomes on other issues in terms of indigenous fish potentially, rather than salmon spawning. In fact, I've been told that we're not actually concerned about salmon yet. That is what's triggered the consent. So that's the issue.
I think it's an RMA related thing, to be honest, in the Section 6, but so it's not as easy for us to change that. But I think in terms of outside the wet area, there's something there to think about. David, last question.
Thanks. The gravel management meetings were very informative and well worthwhile, and thank you for coming along today to elaborate a little further. I see this is probably a comment to you and more of a question to staff. I see in your report you talk about in your points 7, 8, 12 and 14 that you agree, but you have suggestions, some of which you've elaborated a little on today. But I suppose I'd like to see, when the final report comes back, an indication from staff that they've addressed the concerns that or suggestions that you have added, and whether or not they've been incorporated in the final draft. So again, thanks for your coming along today, and it's been extremely helpful.
Thanks, David. I think that's pretty normal standard process, so that will be part of it. So thank you. Thank you, Nathan, again, for a great presentation and lots of food for thought for us. So thank you.
Thank you.
So if our next presenter, Grant, is Grant here? Yeah. So if Grant Davey is here, then happy. I know it's a bit earlier than we thought we'd be. So if you're happy, if not, we can have a little pause. But if you're happy, just come up shortly, and we'll get into it. But all good. Take your time. We're a bit ahead, so that's all good. Kia ora, Grant. Welcome here, and you're on behalf of the Ashley Rakahuri River Care Group. So we've got 15 minutes for your session, and as you've seen, if there's a bit of time, we could ask questions to fill up that 15 minutes. So thank you. Over to you.
Yeah, Grant Davey from the operations. I'm the operations manager for the Ashley Rakahuri River Care Group. It's a totally voluntary position. Just to introduce myself a bit first, I come from a South Canterbury farming background and then the mining industry, and I've been a mineral exploration geologist in several countries. I've also been a hydrogeologist at ECAN for a period, and prior to this I was a consents investigating officer for a very short time. As well as a geology degree, I have a postgraduate diploma in environmental science, which has included papers in hydrology and flood hazards. For about 8 years I've been doing voluntary work with the River Care Group, working directly with the birds, which is what we're about, and on their habitat. And during that time, and before that, I've tried to fully familiarise myself with the characteristics of braided rivers. Overall, I think this strategy is a good document from our point of view, particularly the outcomes section, with a section called The Extent and Natural Character of Braided Rivers Increases. There appears to be a greater focus on environmental matters than before. But some comments, and hopefully I'm just enlarging on what I submitted rather than introducing anything new. And some of them are maybe more applicable to guidelines rather than strategy. But first, I'd like to emphasise the need to use gravel extraction to improve the natural braided character of rivers, especially smaller ones like the Ashley, which have been constricted too much and lost braiding. Braided river birds need braids, and they overwhelmingly nest on islands. They feed in shallow braids rather than fast-moving water in single channels. And braiding can be increased with gravel extraction by the excavation of new arcuate channels instead of just digging a hole somewhere, and as opposed to a straight deep channel down the middle of the river, which sometimes happens. And this would benefit not only birds, but no doubt other fauna that live on the rivers. I'm not sure that people realise just how endangered some of the bird species that nest out there are. For example, in the last few years, only about 20% of black-fronted tern nests on the Ashley have produced a fledgling, and they're on the path to extinction. so we have to look after them in any way we can. Predators have been the main problem, but habitat is very important too. For years, the Rivercare Group has been talking to extractors about the above, and more recently giving them formal presentations, and they have been very receptive to our requests. I'd have to mention especially Taggart and Southern Screenworks. And I think that volunteer outfits such as us should be more formally consulted about consents and authorisations. And we've found lately that the consent staff have actually been doing this. But we're not getting enough consultation from the river engineers on gravel extraction and other aspects of river management. This is getting slightly off topic, but I really don't like it when our predator traps are dozed without warning. We need to set up some form of regular meetings to handle this sort of thing. Gravel extraction is of course used for flood protection, and in the case of the Ashley River below the Okuku Junction, it is essential as part of the effort to get the river away from the south bank where it is a danger. If you do that, you're helping two things. You're helping the flood situation and you're helping the environmental situation at the same time. So extractors and environment can work together. Removal of weeds by extractors is also very beneficial to birds, and that actually happens quite a lot. And they should be encouraged to do more. Just a couple of extra hours can be very beneficial. There's mention in the document about exploring the use of imagery before and after extraction to pre-plan extraction campaigns. And this is surely essential. In the mining industry in the developed world, detailed plans of any proposed mining are mandatory in the consent or permitting process. It's quite astonishing to me that this hasn't been the case in gravel extraction here. It isn't an onerous or expensive thing to do. Just an hour or two of drone flying, image processing and drawing some lines on a map will suffice to show pretty much exactly what is planned. I can do all this myself. It's only a couple of hours for a kilometre of river by about 400 metres wide. It's just utterly not a big deal. It might be thought that floods will wipe out extraction scars and new channels and things very quickly, but in the case of the Ashley and other small rivers, this is not necessarily the case, and those new channels could last for years. And from talking to extractors, ECANT hasn't in the past given consent holders much guidance on exactly where or how to extract. There are rules on what they can't do, but little on what they should do. Also concerned about the need to keep extraction sustainable. This is addressed in rivers like the Ashley, where bed surveying is done, and when levels get too low, no more extraction can happen. But rivers like the Waipara, where there's been some large consent applications in recent time, don't, to my knowledge, have such surveying, and there's been some very large consent applications made, which I'm sure aren't sustainable. But I know if people realise in some European countries, gravel mining is simply not allowed in rivers due to destruction of the natural environment and danger to infrastructure. And I'm concerned about the quality of the AEEs. I'm well acquainted with groundwater AEEs. When I was at ECAN, they were of pretty variable quality, but the gravel ones I've seen are much worse. They tend to be written by people who have no knowledge of braided rivers, obviously haven't been to the river in question, and just copy and paste from previous efforts. Sometimes, for example, neglecting to change even river names from the previous application. If they were serious about environmental aspects of gravel extraction on the Ashleys, they should talk to us. And this has never happened. They would find us very cooperative. The consent staff I've talked to about this issue agree about the qualities of these AEEs, but they don't appear to be able to do anything about it. And I think the consultants who write AEEs like this are just ripping off their clients. Also a bit concerned about the issue of consents versus authorisations, the latter seeming to attract less environmental scrutiny. Nowadays it seems that consents are so expensive and time-consuming to get that some of the extractors are just planning to use authorisations. Another major issue I have is safety. In the international mining industry, safety is a massive priority. And gravel extraction must be by far the biggest mining industry in Canterbury. Might not be called that, but that's what it is. But safety does not figure in this document that I could see. And I realise that ECAN cannot regulate or police safety in all the gravel extraction operations it consents. It must at least have some responsibility for operations on its land, such as in the Lower Ashley. Not really talking about safety of the operators, but safety of the general public, including our volunteers. And I've seen and experienced truly hair-raising incidents, and I'm not exaggerating at all, especially of trucks going fast over blind stop banks, single-lane public access ways to the river, without even there being signs in place to warn anybody. And this is commonplace. Also, it's common to see vertical faces of about 2 metres high left out in the river, and the most recent case of that was just below the State Highway 1 bridge. And Hearns do donuts there at night, and I'm astonished that nobody has toppled into one of them that I know of. And they're not signposted, flagged off or anything. And this neglect of safety in this age of road cones everywhere, given the emphasis on safety in all other aspects of life, is pretty astonishing. I'm not certain about legal obligations, but there are most certainly moral ones. If ECAN consent gravel operations on their own land, there are obligations. I think compliance monitoring needs improved. So there have been recent cases of extractors kicked off the Ashley for breaching their consent conditions and then popping up somewhere else after far too short a period. Another problem which is out there is I'm sure extractors shouldn't be allowed to process and make large, long life stockpiles of gravel out on the fairways of the rivers. This restricts flow, diverts it towards the banks, increases flood hazards and reduces bird habitat. And you see those stockpiles being partly eroded away. Just one last thing. I haven't actually said anything about the bird survey conditions. They're actually really pretty good. And if people stick to them, it shouldn't be a problem. But they do need repeated. If gravel extraction stops for 2 or 3 weeks, they come back, you might find there's 30 nests of an extremely endangered bird all over the area where they plan to abstract, and a new survey is necessary in that case. Yeah, that's what I've got to say.
Grant. Hey, kia ora, Grant. Thank you so much for a really thoughtful submission. Lots of evidence from on the ground that you've produced. Any questions from councillors? Grant Edge, Councillor Edge.
Hi, Grant. Thanks for your submission, and I'm aware of some of the issues on the Ashley Rakahuri. I was interested in your comment that there's lack of consultation by Environment Canterbury in terms of local awareness and with groups like yourselves providing some input into the information sharing process. There is a section on page 7 of the document that says who is involved in their role. Do you think that it's potentially missing some other person in terms, or some organisation to talk with local environmental river care groups? Should they be involved as part of the information sharing pre-consent stuff? Is that something that you think should happen?
Yes, but as I said, the consents people have been telling us about some consents and applications, etc., recently, which is a lot better. And but some other aspects we're not getting the consultation that is necessary. We're not hearing from the river engineers nearly as much as we should, and we can help. Such as a few years ago, there was a total cowboy taking gravel just right beside Rangiora with no consent, no nothing. I assumed that they had something, and didn't report it, but they didn't. So if we know what's going on, we can help. So yeah, well, I'm out there all the time.
Thank you, Grant. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, follow up. Your other point was about, and looking at your submission here, taking a holistic whole of river view in terms of the values of the river. You think that that's really important, that those things are considered as part of the issuing of authorisations or consent?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, just push your button, Grant. Yeah.
It keeps going off, yeah. These rivers are not just a resource for gravel. They're really important, unique habitat for the birds. And we can all work together. We're not rampant greenies who think there shouldn't be any gravel extraction. Some is obviously necessary, and it can be done with, I think, minimal extra expenditure in such a way as it actually improves the environment.
Thank you, Grant. Ian, and then I've got Councillor Korako and then Councillor Southworth if there's time.
Thank you for your submission. Quite a lot of your comments and suggestions sit within our code of practice for the gravel extraction operators. Have you read our code of practice and are you comfortable with that, or have you read it and do you think it doesn't go far enough in terms of satisfying your concerns?
Yeah, I haven't actually read it just recently, but I've certainly read it quite a number of times, and I think it definitely needs re-looked at, especially with the aspect of it says where gravel extractors can't take gravel, like close to stop banks or bridges or not too deep, but it doesn't actually say where they should.
That will be dealt with in the terms of if it's a gravel authorisation, that will be dealt with within the authorisation. And I guess, so the follow-up question to this is, are you familiar with the information, the LiDAR information and everything else that our river engineers team are using to enable authorisations and or then the trigger to go to consents?
Yeah, I'm certainly familiar with that on the Ashley, and I'm well aware that they use that to make sure that there really is, it is something of a sustainable operation, but it doesn't appear to me to be the case on some of the other rivers like the Waipara, where you read the availability report which just says it's available. It has a photo of some gravel and says there's 50,000 cubic metres available. So that, to my mind, is just not good enough.
Yeah, I mean, the reports themselves actually have more detail, but maybe there's a clear case for better liaison, which is the point you made, so thank you for that.
Thanks, Ian. Nook.
Kia ora, Grant. I'm in an area where there's actually quite a narrow bandwidth, so some of it, I got most of your submission, and thank you so much. It was an excellent submission, and it was well articulated. I was also on the same kind of questioning as Councillor McKenzie, in whether you thought that there needed to be a refresh, actually, on the Canterbury Regional Council documents. And you answered the question, which is pretty much yes. Hey, I may have missed it, but the relationship with Mana Whenua, and that would be Ngāi Tuahuriri, I mean, that is quite an important, do you believe that's quite an important kind of relationship to have when talking about the Rakahuri? Definitely. And also the other rivers as well, but particularly the Rakahuri, the Ashley.
Push your button, Grant, so we can.
Sorry, I keep doing that. Yeah, but we have a lot of trouble interfacing with people to talk to. We try, but there's never been an iwi member on our River Care group, for example. We're just unable to do what we'd like to do.
Thanks, Grant.
Okay,
Yes.
so hey, can I just a comment? What needs to happen too then is that there needs to be a strengthening of the mana whenua relationship, and particularly acknowledged in the kind of refresh document as well. But is that what you're saying, Grant? Is that actually there's a whole lot of room for improvement with mana whenua relationship?
Yeah, definitely. We reach out.
Absolutely. Okay.
Yeah, we reach out, and it's not working.
Thanks, Grant. Thanks, Nick.
Okay. Right. We'll work on that. Thank you.
We've run out of time there, but thank you for your submission. Thanks for questions from councillors. And sorry, Vicky, I couldn't fit your one in. So, Ted, I know you've popped in online there from Kaikoura, so great to see you. You're up next. Are you happy to go now? We're a bit ahead of time, but are you happy to go now?
Yep, very happy. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. We can definitely hear you. Thank you. So 15 minutes for the slot, and if you leave us some time for questions, then we'll have time for that. So where you go.
Yeah. Firstly, I just took to everything that Grant said. He's covered a lot of the points that I had in my submission, but our situation up here in Kaikoura is a little different, and that is that we are still very much dealing with the aftermath of the 2016 earthquake, and particularly in respect of the Kowhai River, there is a vast amount of gravel, like millions of cubic meters, that's currently in the mid-reaches of the Kowhai on its way down. Was initially deposited in the upper reaches, and I know it well because it was initially deposited just a couple of 100 metres from the hut in Shearwater, a research hut that I spent quite a bit of time in. And it completely dammed the river there. But it washed out quite quickly and made its way down to the mid-reaches of the river, around the general area of the Kowhai hut, where it lifted that bed about 8 metres. And it's currently on its way down and is starting to appear at the bottom of those mid-reaches and out onto the flats. But there's enough material there to completely overwhelm the stop banks. So we have a situation in Kaikoura where we have, it's really complex. We've got all of the issues around giving the braided rivers enough room to do their natural thing. We don't want them to be too natural because, as we all know, a braided river will naturally cover the entire plain, given the chance. So to keep our human infrastructure and our human habitation, we need to constrain it, but we don't want to over-constrain it. We want to keep it as close to natural as we can. And then within that, we've got all the issues of managing weeds and pests. And I think it's very easy to get a lot better results, as Grant says, by doing a lot better communication. There are people like myself, like Grant, who spend a fair amount of time in the rivers, working with BirdLife. There are farmers on the banks that spend a lot of time in the rivers. We have one in the Kowhai who does horse trekking up the river. That individual has a very good idea of what's going on because he walks up and down the river with horses and he can see big boulders disappearing under the gravels as the gravels come down. But when I was last talking to the river engineers, they were unable to consider that material coming down because it was too far up and their rules wouldn't let them consider it because it was more than some number of kilometres from the point of the gravel extraction. And their rules wouldn't allow them to consider it. And that, to me, is a form of insanity. When we over-constrain ourselves with rules such that we're creating problems. One of my favourite complexity theorists is Dave Snowden, and Dave was actually employed by ECAN 20-odd years ago when the Canterbury Water Management Strategy was first being set up. And in 2007, Dave's Cynefin framework for management of complex systems was actually in the Harvard Business Review. And he's really clear that you can only tightly constrain with rules simple systems where you know all the inputs and all the outputs, and you can have really good rules and you can constrain a system closely under those conditions. But when you move into complicated and complex systems, you have to change the way you manage them. And when you're dealing with complex systems, rules are there really as guidelines and to constrain cheats. And what you need to do is give the people who are actually on the ground responsible for management as much freedom as possible to probe that system, see what works, amplify things going in directions we want, dampen down things going in other directions, and repeat. And what works like 2 kilometers upstream might not work down here. So, yeah, giving the people on the ground sufficient awareness of all the different values present, giving them the responsibility to do what they know to be the right thing, I think is essential if we're to get the sorts of outcomes we need, where both our human infrastructure, our way of life continues, but also the natural world. And like Grant, I see some insane things out in the riverbed, like pits with 2 metre, 3 metre vertical walls, and no indication that they're there. And if you're walking along the river at night, looking through a thermal imaging scope, it can be kind of interesting when you suddenly stumble into one of these things. Yeah, so why people are allowed to do that, I don't know. It would make sense to me to always have a slope on any extraction pit that someone could survivably stumble down, rather than something vertical that you can crack your skull on. But yeah, that's the general thrust of my whole submission, is to make people as aware as possible of all of the values that are present, and then give them the freedom to use their intelligence to produce the best outcome that can be got in that particular place at that particular time. And that's always going to change. So thank you for this opportunity, and I'm open for questions.
Kia ora, Ted. Thoughtful as ever, and great insights as well about your local area. I've got Vicky first and then Peter. So where you go, Councillor Southworth?
Cool. Kia ora. Thanks, Ted. And yeah, really interesting. It sounds like the common theme in the two presentations, yours and Grant's previously, is around the connections and relationships and communication. And my past, I worked as a planner looking at mineral strategy in the UK. And we had forums, like community forums that had community groups and the extraction industry and the council staff coming together on an annual basis. But it meant that there were key issues got raised, agenda was put together, and the connections were made so that the connections were there to be made in the interim as and when things were coming up, and you knew who to go to, and in both ways. Do you think something like that could be helpful here?
Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, something like that I think could be extremely helpful. But in our modern digital age, it seems quite simple to have essentially an open forum where plans, what's suggested is put up, and anyone can register an interest so that they get notified when something new changes, and they can go online, have a look, make a suggestion online, or if necessary, contact the key people and engage. And a lot of the time we don't need to engage, but sometimes we do, because sometimes things really don't make a lot of sense.
Cool. Thanks, Ted. Thanks, Vicky. Peter.
Ted, Peter Scott, good to see you, Ted. I just want a bit of an idea of you around the Snowden idea about optimal outcomes. I never are never actually achieved by a rules-based system, which that's really good thinking. But I would put to you, Ted, that in the area of rivers and river control and the management of those rivers for the safety of people and protection of communities, which there's some stuff that's happened where we've built on rib planes and those sorts of things. So our opportunity to do that is more simplistic than just saying we need everyone involved when we need to do some work. And I would look at the fact that we're heading into a litigious area now with this stuff if we don't do our job properly. So I'm just wondering how the Snowden approach and what we are required to do actually fit together.
Thanks, Peter. Well, now you're talking about fundamental reform of global economic, political, and legislative systems, which is what's required for the future of humanity, but it's a little beyond the few minutes I have left in this gravel management strategy.
Ted, I shouldn't have said that, should I? I shouldn't have said that to you.
You probably should not, but no, look, I'd love to share a discussion with you some week as we were tramping somewhere. But yeah, look, I appreciate the difficulty that you as councillors within the current litigious system have. And I think it is possible to move significantly towards what Snowden would see as an optimal system while still retaining sufficient rules to be able to constrain the worst of cheating strategies, which I think is as close as optimal as we're going to get in the current system.
Thanks, Ted. Great answer. I've got Dion and then Councillor Reg. So where you go, Councillor Swiggs?
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I do like your last point that you raised on the do you have anything else to add for the revised strategy. I think it kind of summed up what you were going to say there. But one question I have of you is in your submission, you say you do not like the use of ideas like life force. Have you got any suggestions around what may be better to use, in your opinion?
Well, a modern understanding of biology, of evolutionary theory, like the definition of life I find most useful is of life being systems capable of searching the space of possible systems for the survivable. And that can start out really simple and it rapidly builds in complexity. So by the time you get to something like a human being, you're looking at a stack of systems about 15 levels deep, roughly 1,000 or so systems at each level, all interacting, like the sort of complexity that no human mind could possibly deal with, even in the age of the universe, the time that remains before the heat death. So like we are demonstrably that complex. And we all need simple ideas, and the idea of life force has some things to recommend it. But what we actually see now, when we look deeply, we see these complex systems interacting. And the more we can deal with the complexity and uncertainty that's demonstrably there, the better our outcomes are going to be. So, yeah, if you have to simplify, life force is not a bad simplification, but if you've got a little bit of time to deal with the complexity, let's deal with the complexity.
Thank you.
Got it, Ted. Grant?
Oh, hi, Ted. And just picking up on sort of some of the themes you're talking about, the earthquakes and the problems with that. I'm looking at the Environment Canterbury Climate Action Plan, and one of the sub-actions in it, B5, talks about support for Braided River revival strategies to integrate actions which enhance climate resilience and sequestration opportunities. Do you think going forward that this the draft document that we've got for the rivers is adequately dealing with the future, I suppose, in terms of climate adaptation, climate mitigation?
Oh, this is another hornet's nest that we could dive into for a month or three. the idea of sequestration opportunities in a braided river system makes no sense to me, because periodic floods are going to destroy whatever is in there. So everything's going to be flattened back to gravels with some frequency. Might be yearly, 10 yearly, 50 yearly, 100 yearly. So, yeah, I don't think that aspect, the sequestration aspect, is relevant to braided river systems. But the rest of it, in terms of the changes in the amount of gravels that are going to be transported down those systems as a result of the changes in the rainfall patterns, and what we see from the climate models is that we're going to get more periods of calm, but then when things do turn nasty, we're likely to see much higher rainfall events. So less frequent, but much greater intensity. And that means far bigger pulses of gravels coming down, which means we have to build our stop banks higher, reinforce them with bigger boulders, all of this stuff. And one of the little problems we have in the Kowhai is that we had quite a bit of boulders stacked up there that the river team had built on, but after the earthquake, those boulders were needed elsewhere. So they all got nicked and taken to other projects. And now the local community is, Nectar didn't pay that cost, didn't replace them. So yeah, we had built up a bit of resilience there, and it's gone. So yeah, there's lots happening there.
Kia ora, thanks, Ted. I think that's all the questions I've got for this, and we've reached our 15 minutes. So thank you, Ted. Like I said, very informative, and a great conversation with you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, team.
Kia ora. Thank you.
Kia ora.
Okay, next up, Shona, is it? Kia ora, Shona. And sorry, I don't have a name for your colleague, but I'm sure you'll introduce yourself. So I'll hand over to you. You got 15 minutes as the other presenters, and leave us some time for questions if you're keen on that. So thank you.
Tēnā koutou ko Shona Walter tōku ingoa. I'm legal counsel for Ellesmere Extraction and Aggregate Limited, and Sandy Shirtcliffe to my right here is the founder of Ellesmere Extraction, and he'll speak to to our submission after me. Sandy started this company 17 years ago. Ellesmere Extraction extracts gravel from the Rakaia River and provides a variety of aggregate products for roading, construction, and retail. Over this period, Sandy has invested approximately $4.1 million on the site, vehicles, and equipment, and has an annual turnover of approximately $2.4 million. Sandy is currently applying for his third consent to extract gravel, and has told me how complicated, time-consuming, and expensive the consenting process is compared to previously. This was his motivation to submit on the draft strategy. We acknowledge the time and work involved in producing the draft strategy. Nonetheless, Sandy and other gravel extractors have expressed real concerns about the draft strategy. Our office prepared a detailed submission on the draft strategy, and I will present a summary of the key issues raised in that submission. Point 1, the draft strategy is inconsistent with relevant RMA planning documents. The draft strategy states that its role is to deliver the overarching planning and decision-making framework to achieve a whole-of-river approach. The whole-of-river approach is inconsistent with the provisions of the Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan relevant to gravel extraction, which takes a flood protection approach to managing activities in Canterbury's rivers. The draft strategy has departed from the traditional flood protection role as determined by the RMA and implemented by the RPS and Canterbury Land and Water Regional Plan. The draft strategy seeks to impose stricter requirements than higher order RMA documents and proposes to do this through a Local Government Act procedure, a process that sits outside of the RMA and not subject to the same level of debate and public scrutiny as the process set out in Schedule 1 of the RMA. Point 2, the draft strategy lacks balance. When read as a whole, the draft strategy gives undue weight to environmental effects and cultural values, and fails to recognise the strategic importance of gravel as a natural resource and its critical role to Canterbury's construction sector. In comparison, the operative gravel management strategy explains how residential and commercial development in Canterbury depend on the ability to access gravel, and how ECAN must ensure the business of gravel extraction from floods is financially viable for contractors. Otherwise, the cost to remove gravel and the increased flood risk will be borne by the community. This perspective is currently absent from the draft strategy. Point 3, the unlawfulness of some draft strategy provisions. Part 4 of the draft strategy contains decision-making criteria to avoid allocating volumes greater than 60,000 metres cubed and durations longer than 1 to 2 years. These provisions are specifically relevant to decision-making on RMA resource consent applications and decision-making on RMA regional and district planning instruments. The use of avoid-type policies and criteria have important consequences for decision-making in the RMA context. In addition, Part 4 of the draft strategy is inconsistent with Section 104.2a and case law, which provides that when consent authorities determine the duration of consents, they must take into account whether the application is to continue an existing operation and the level of investment made by the applicant in his business over time. Point 4. The draft strategy is contrary to recent freshwater planning amendments to the RMA. When considering a resource consent application, Section 104.2f of the RMA directs consent authorities to not have regard to the Te Mana o Te Wai hierarchy of obligations in the MPSFM. The Te Mana o Te Wai hierarchy obligations bear a strikingly strong resemblance to GP1 of the draft strategy, which is as follows: that any gravel extraction permission first consider the health and well-being of the river, then the health and protection needs of people, and finally, the ability of communities to provide for their social, economic, and cultural well-being now and in the future. GP1 is contrary to what Section 104.2f directs consent authorities to consider during a consent application. The conclusion is that GP1 cannot be a relevant matter of consideration under Section 104 and must be removed from the draft strategy. In summary, through a Local Government Act process, the draft strategy seeks to import very directive and stringent provisions into the RMA decision-making process that are highly prejudicial to the gravel extraction business. And now Sandy will speak to some aspects of his operations.
Good morning. First of all, flood management is what this whole thing's about. And second of all, is supplying material to society. Because whatever you've, in this whole room, it's concrete floor, concrete walls, there's a road outside, it's all aggregate. So the two of them are linked together very, very closely. And so when I picked the spot in the Rakaia River, it was for sustainability, for a long, long term, and the society would be getting the stuff that we make. So just to give some cost aspects to this, in 2008, to get a resource consent took 6 weeks and cost $2,500. I had to get another one in 2013 because the river engineer decided we needed to move to a better spot. That was $5,000. I then got another one in 2018, which was $7,000. We applied for renewal in 2023 in February. 27 months later, I'm still in process. 9 months ago, they stopped me under 124. I have been working under GAs, which take 10 working days, which are actually 4 to 5 months for a GA. We're running from one disaster to the next disaster to the next disaster. And by the time Shona is finished and I get my resource consent, I will have spent over $100,000. That's a 1,500% increase in the cost of a resource consent, and I haven't asked to do anything different than I've done for the last 10 years. So that is that side of it. Now the next side of it is, in the last 17 years, which the anniversary, believe it or not, is today, and I have paid $82,000 in royalties, and I've moved $5 million worth of shingle if you had to pay for it to be moved out of the river yourself, which is about 680,000 cubic metres of material. So if I hadn't have taken that out, you probably wouldn't have had to do it in the next 10 or 15 years, but maybe in the next 50 you might have, because we've had surveys done for the last 2 lots of consents by LIDAR, and the shingle we take out, which is 50,000 cubes a year, is replaced in the 5 years. We have an area of 62 hectares, which is it's 1 million squares we're allowed to take shingle from, and it's an average of 1 metre deep, so that's 1 million cubic metres. We take 50,000. That's about 5%, if not less, of what's available. So we just take that little bit, it keeps coming in. We then supply the community with all sorts of specialist sands and other things, and if the community didn't need it or didn't want it, I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you, because my business would be dead in the water and there'd be no one here. And everybody else that sat at this table, the supply to the community is why they're sitting here, because if the community didn't want it, they wouldn't be here. You learn that in the third form. Supply and demand is basic economics. And that's where, this is how simple this stuff is. And so the biggest impact on society this whole 27-month drama's created is I was donating $10,000 a month, $10,000 a year to the Salmon Sports Trust to teach kids to ride bikes, to do get elderly people out walking around and doing all sorts of stuff. And because we felt so lucky to be able to have this resource consent and so lucky to be able to do what we do for the community, we would donate that money. There was also another $2,000 went to, there were some disabled kids in town, the local rugby club. We donate sand to all the schools for their sand pits. If anybody wants sand for a sandpit company policy, it's free, because you can't beat a kid playing in sand. Well, after this 27-month debacle, we had to have a company meeting and we had to make a very, very shitty decision. And the decision was we had to stop giving all money out to non-profitable organisations, because we couldn't afford to sustain the cost of getting a new resource consent and also helping the community. So we're hoping that we'll get our new resource consent, we might make a couple of dollars and get back on our feet, and we can go back to supporting community projects. But at the moment, I'm sorry, we've had to stop. And you don't understand what it's like to have a phone call from someone who knows that every year you give $500 or $1,000 or $250, and you had to say, I'm sorry, I can't donate anymore because I'm in this whole predicament and I don't know how I got here. And they miss out on their $500, their $10,000, they just miss out. So I think that's all I need to say.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
Kia ora, Shona and Sandy. Thanks for sharing your story and the work that your company does. Have I got any questions? Peter?
Yeah, my question is pretty simple, and you'll be able to answer it very quickly. So the refresh rate in terms of where you're taking it, how long does it take to refresh the area from where you're taking?
It depends. Because the area is so big, normally about 2 floods. So in one instance, we ended up with an area of about 30,000 cubes taken out. We had a fresh, and that was about 6,000 cumex, and it took about a day and a half, and it was full again, and it's actually higher. And the 17 years I've been out there every day, basically, for 17 years. And Verity Cassistan, the river engineer who's now left Environment Canterbury, I would quite often ring her and say, can you call in on your way past, because I want to show you what the river's done, just so she would see the shingle that it moves overnight with the fresh is just out the gate. And one thing I have learnt from the Turner boys, because they've been out there their whole lives basically, is the big fresh that comes through in a rush, that's not the one that causes all the shingle movement. It's the up to 1,000, down to 800, up to 1,600, back to 700. And those ones that go on for 3 or 4 weeks, they're the ones that really shift serious amounts of aggregate. But honestly, when they do the LIDAR thing and then they come back 5 years and do the same, the amount of shingle is identical basically within a few hundred cubic metres.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Sandy. Ian.
Yeah, look, thank you for your submission, and we understand your frustrations, but we would like to have thought that what we're trying to do, or would like to think that what we're trying to do here is should not necessarily solve your issues, but make the authorisations or the consenting systems clearer, easier, and hopefully cheaper. But Shona, if I could go back to your submission your combined submission, and you talked about GP1 on page 16 of the draft strategy. We thought, well, I guess my reading of the strategy is that we thought we were making it very clear that taking shingle for flood protection was quite a high priority, and I recognise that GP1 doesn't actually say that. It does create a hierarchy. In practice, I think we'd like to think that that won't be the hierarchy because we have permissions from working with Runanga in helping draft this. There's been no pushback from Runanga on taking shingle for flood protection. Does that give you enough assurance, or would you like some more safeguards, I guess is what I'm asking.
The relief in our submission is set out in Appendix B, but the current wording of the draft strategy doesn't really provide much assurance whatsoever. Furthermore, if the draft strategy, if the regional council is seeking to fundamentally change their approach to rivers, then that should be done through perhaps the review of the RPS and through a Schedule 1 RMA type procedure, so that there's wider community involvement rather than doing it through this type of procedure. I think that would be our recommendation.
Thanks, Ian. I've got Dion. Did you have a question?
Yeah, mine was actually very similar to Ian's question. Thanks for your submission. It's very, very well laid out, and thanks for your the time you've taken. I appreciate it, and I've listened to what you're saying.
John.
Thank you again, and my question's been answered around the legality. So thanks, Sandy, for the submission. Very powerful, and hopefully we can get someone along the lines. Cheers.
Time for one more, Grant.
And just getting onto that same sort of question, in terms of the Local Government Act, we're required to provide plans for the future for our intergenerational plans. One of the plans we prepare is to do with the long-term plan, and the 30-year infrastructure strategy is incorporated into the long-term plan, and that is fully available for public consultation when we do that. One of the things in the 30-year infrastructure plan identifies the transition or the goal for the future is to transition a little bit away from a pure engineering approach to river management to take into account multiple values of the river in terms of natural character, those sorts of things that are in the document. So it's a whole of river approach. Are you familiar with the 30-year infrastructure plan?
No, not in great detail, I'm afraid, so I wouldn't be able to answer any specific questions about that 30-year plan, I'm afraid.
Well, good. Thanks, Grant. Thanks, Shona. Thanks, Sandy. Appreciate your time. Thank you. Robert. Kia ora, Robert. Welcome here. Thanks for being here, and you've heard the spiel about the time, so 15 minutes. If you leave us some time for questions, that's great. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I've asked my submission, or feedback as it's called, is pre-circulated to you, so I hope you've got a copy of what I have in front of me today. I don't propose to go through my full introduction, aside to note that I've worked for DOC, I've worked for ECAN, I've worked for industry, I'm now working for myself, and I have a number of concerns about the strategy. I just preface my comments with the fact that there is an existing strategy, so we can, if you can accept that the existing strategy has been in place for over 10 years and has apparently worked quite well, there are some issues with how it's been applied, in terms of consent processing, and I think that's the fundamental issue that we're going to be dealing with this revised strategy, in that it becomes a pseudo plan, and you've heard from others this morning talking about it being used as a plan. That is our experience. So I'll start at point 3.1. Despite statements to the contrary, the draft strategy is not a revision at all. Instead, it's a completely new document. So to call it a revision is actually misleading. Moreover, it sits under the draft Braided River Revival 100-year strategy, which identifies an overarching set of outcomes that ECAN seeks to achieve through its work and decision-making in rivers. The draft Braided River Revival strategy is described as a non-statutory strategy, whereas the GMS is prepared under the Local Government Act. This draft strategy has some relationship to the Canterbury Biodiversity Strategy as well, described as a non-binding, non-statutory document, but shown as sitting above the regional policy statement and regional plans as a de facto superior document. And that's shown in that document. And the Environment Canterbury Climate Action Plan, the CAP, which is focused on building impactful, equitable and holistic climate action for our region, whatever that may mean. This describes a confounding suite of statutory and non-statutory ECAN documents associated with the GMS that are intertwined and interact with each other in ways that are not strictly linear or immediately obvious. That's a big problem. I'll return to this aspect shortly. The review of the GMS is predicated on the basis that a lot has changed since we first devised our Canterbury River Gravel Management Strategy 2012. We've reviewed the strategy to ensure that it's effective and fit for purpose. There's nothing anywhere to substantiate or to explain what has changed or what has been needed to make it fit for purpose or what was not fit for purpose about the existing gravel management strategy. Nowhere is there any explanation of that. Problematic for someone like me. I'm a planner. I do drill into details. I like to know the whats, the whys and the hows. Nothing. Deadly silence on that one. So no explanations provided, no indication of why or how it's not effective for the purposes given. And I'm at a loss to understand what these many changes may be. The overarching purpose and principles of the Act haven't changed at all over this period. And the 2012 Gravel Management Strategy, despite the manner in which ECAN has applied it through the consent processing process, does not appear to be ineffective or unfit for purpose. I'd note, though, that I've got no difficulty with the review of the Gravel Management Strategy. After 13 years, that's entirely appropriate. What's alarming in this instance is the complete replacement of the GMS with an entirely new document masquerading as a review and the manner in which this has occurred. In inviting feedback on the strategy, ECAN notified industry participants of the proposed draft back on 18th of March, providing effectively 12 working days to prepare any feedback. Following several requests, ECAN agreed to extend the deadline by 5 working days to the 14th of April. No hearings were contemplated, and I understand today is not a hearing as well. That's intriguing. It's a Local Government Act document. No hearings are contemplated. Access to the Braided River Revival Strategy was only made available on the 1st of April. And that is an overarching strategy above the GMS. After further requests, ECAN has advised that hearings would occur today, but it has been clarified that this is not a formal hearing. This suggests a calculated strategy to minimise engagement and to predetermine the outcome of this revision. Further, and despite several requests, no record of the evaluation process used to develop the draft strategy has been provided. Although Lee Griffith did set out a list of industry engagements held since 2021 that provided opportunities for input to the review. Those industry engagements that I attended lacked specific details as to the scale and nature of the revisions proposed. As a result, the 18th March advisory was the first opportunity for industry participants to see the form and substance of the completely new document. The draft GMS is also directive as to changes to RMA-based regional plans. and the resource consent decision-making process, which is not legally appropriate. With any RMA-based changes, an analysis of options or an evaluation report as required by RMA Section 32 and 32AA would be the minimum expected here. Likewise, given that the draft GMS is a completely new document, an analysis of the approaches chosen is mandated by Section 13 of the Local Government Act. Both acts are aligned in requiring this type of assessment. To date, there is no sign that such a process has been followed, nor that the replacement of the GMS is built on evidence-based foundations. And for these reasons, it's recommended that the draft GMS should not be adopted and should instead be rejected. And I appreciate that that's going to be quite challenging for you, but that is the position that we've taken on this. Increasing complexity, and I want to touch on this, it's quite important. It's an element that was dealt with by the previous submitters. Returning to the complexities of the regulatory environment created by the GMS, as discussed earlier, I'd observe that the draft GMS asserts a level of direction to RMA processes that is far outside its statutory mandate. For example, reference to RMA subordinate documents on page 8 and the purpose statement on page 5 suggests that the strategy is to be elevated to a status that is not legitimate under the RMA. While the GMS may be had regard to in determining any resource consent application, it cannot be directive of any specific outcome. The GMS Part 4 decision-making criteria does not match the expectations of a strategy, but rather is more representative of a regulatory controls as a de facto regional plan. And it has been discussed by others as rules, which is extraordinary. While it's recognised that a strategy should be aspirational, it is not the function of a strategy prepared under the Local Government Act to direct decision-making under the RMA. In addition to these concerns is the burden that this increased complexity creates for applicants for resource consent. Alongside the substantial cost of seeking consent is the uncertainty and difficulty of navigating the multiple planning frameworks. And to illustrate this point, a standard application for consent to extract and process aggregates from a braided river system in the Canterbury region would typically involve assessment against the provisions of the following documents: the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement, which also requires natural character assessment under the Natural Character Assessment Guidelines, the Land and Water Regional Plan, any specific river regional plan, such as Hurunui, Opahi, Pariora, Waimakariri, the Canterbury Air Regional Plan, the Canterbury Regional Council Flood Protection and Drainage Bylaw, the Canterbury Regional River Gravel Management Strategy. It also requires obtaining a gravel availability assessment report, the Canterbury Regional Council River Gravel Extraction Code of Practice. That is just a standard resource consent application. Must look at all of those documents. To now hear that the GMS requires additional assessment against the braided river revival 100-year strategy, the biodiversity strategy, and potentially the climate action plan is extraordinary. A strategy should not necessarily be something that has to be assessed as part of a consent application. These assessments also sit alongside the requirement to obtain affected party approvals, consult with relevant runaka, obtain a licence or concession from LINZ, DOC or ECAN, and potentially to apply for resource consent from the relevant territorial authority. Collectively, this represents a significant investment and risk for any potential applicant. The draft GMS does nothing to simplify or streamline this process. Instead, it adds substantially to this confounding tranche of regulatory hoops. And sitting alongside this highly regulated element is the manner in which ECAN processes consent applications for aggregate extraction. I'd note that the extraction process is very much standardised across industry participants. That is, everyone pretty much does the same thing when they extract aggregates, and is well documented. Over the past 20 years, ECAN's granted many hundreds of resource consents and authorisations for aggregate extraction, and would be expected to have a well-practised, a standardised and streamlined process for managing this activity. Sadly, this is not the experience of many applicants. My own experience during the recovery from the Kaikoura earthquakes was that ECAN consent staff relied on guidance of the GMS as an immutable standard that had to be met. Accordingly, multiple consents of short duration and lower volumes, the maximum of 60,000 cubes, were all that was granted despite the obvious urgency and significance of the recovery operations in that part of the country. More recently, renewals of resource consents that would normally be considered routine have taken more than 14 months to be processed. These delays have a profound effect on a contractor's ability to fulfil contracts, program works, employs staff, and it has been explained, and ultimately on the price of aggregates to the community. In addition, ECAN attempted in that case to issue 5 separate resource consents for the activity. 2 under Section 13 for the installation of culverts and land use to excavate gravel, 1 under Section 14 to divert water, and 2 under Section 15 to discharge contaminants to air and water and to discharge sediment to water. In total, these consents included 120 conditions. After requesting that ECAN simply grants 1 comprehensive consent in the interests of integrated management and efficiency and to avoid duplication, ECAN reluctantly issued 3 consents for the activity with a combined total of 86 conditions after 14 months. This illustrates the disconnect between the theory and the practice in this space. While I readily acknowledge and support efforts to avoid, remedy, and mitigate adverse environmental effects from activities associated with aggregate extraction, this must occur in a reasonable and measured way and in a manner that is statutorily robust. The draft GMS represents a significant departure from this principle. It will add substantial costs, uncertainty and delay to the already fraught process with no tangible benefits beyond those available through the existing regime. Accordingly, the draft gravel management strategy should not be adopted and should instead be rejected. Mr. Chairman, I've got a page and a half and I've got 2 minutes. Should I continue or should I allow...
Well, it's totally up to you.
I'll continue to the end.
Robert, but if you want some questions, you'll only have a couple.
Okay.
So what would you like to do?
I'll continue to the end and we'll see how we go. In general then, having set out the key statutory issues with the draft GMS, I would also comment briefly on a range of interpretation and operational failings within the document. To begin, with the exception of the decision-making criteria in Part 4, there is a lack of sub-part reference points throughout the document. Instead, the document relies on various heading formats and bullet points. This is unhelpful for reference to the various subparts in the document. Each part and subpart should include an indexed numbering system for ease of reference. The GMS also makes extensive reference to Waitaha, without any definition or description of the extent of this area. If this is intended to refer to the Canterbury region, that should be established at the outset. If the draft Braided River Revival Strategy, in the draft Braided River Revival Strategy, there are mixed references to Waitaha/Canterbury and Canterbury/Waitaha, but I would point out that the Canterbury region also includes parts of North Otago. The legal extent of the Canterbury region in New Zealand is defined by the local government Canterbury Region Reorganisation Order 1989, which was enacted under the Local Government Act 1974. This reorganisation order established the boundaries of the Canterbury Regional Council and its constituent territorial authorities. If the term Waitaha is to be used as a substitute for the term Canterbury Region, this needs to be clarified. Page 7 of the GMS discusses the role of territorial authorities. It acknowledges that the involvement of TAs increases the complexity of permissions required for gravel extraction, and I'd agree with that. It also increases the cost and timeframes for obtaining approvals. The fact that this does not necessarily improve any environmental outcomes or contribute further to the integrated management of natural and physical resources should also be acknowledged. The strategy should advocate for the transfer of powers from TAs to ECAN for all matters that relate to river-based aggregate extraction. This would simplify and streamline the process and avoid the duplication of effort and costs that currently occurs. Now, that could be directed through the regional policy statement, for example. The GMS also seeks to penalise extractors who do not extract their full allocation of aggregates. This conveniently ignores the myriad factors that affect the ability to extract aggregates. These include changed work priorities, for example, by councils or other clients, cancelled or delayed contracts, river flooding, bird nesting, fish spawning, and restrictive resource consent conditions. These aspects are beyond the control of extractors, and it's patently unreasonable to arbitrarily assume that under-extraction is a deliberate strategy, particularly given the costs and the onerous processes required to obtain approvals in the first place. Given that gravel extraction is tithed and contributes substantial funds towards fluvial monitoring, the strategy should advocate for a more enabling approach to the approvals process. In Part 3, the GMS seeks to require specific assessment of potential impacts of gravel extraction on coastal erosion. This should be deleted. The responsibility for assessing these potential effects and risks rests entirely within ECAN's functions. To rely instead on multiple third-party reports as a basis for gaining this understanding is an inequitable and an inefficient means of modelling effects, particularly if those reports contain conflicting conclusions. These provisions should be deleted. Part 4 of the decision-making criteria includes numerous directive criteria that are not legally valid, are fraught with uncertainty and or exceed the remit of a strategy. For example, the GP1 reference to the hierarchy of obligations, as has been explained, is excluded from consideration by the Resource Management, Freshwater and Other Matters Amendment Act 2024. This reference is invalid and should be deleted. GP5 limits the grant of approvals only to extractors that have a proven record of extracting an undefined high proportion of their past allocations. Without considering the context of previous under-extraction, this approach is manifestly unjust. Other criteria use terms such as impact and resilience levels that are undefined and direct changes to regional plan rules and consent decisions without the necessary assessment. Collectively, the entire Part 4 lacks merit and is legally precarious. This entire section should be deleted. And finally, quickly, for the reasons set out above, I consider the process to revise the gravel management strategy has been misrepresented. Rather than a revision, the entire document has been replaced with a completely different strategy, and the revision has also incorporated additional layers of regulation to further confound the already substantial processes required to obtain approvals. This has been built on a foundation of unsubstantiated claims that a lot has changed since 2012 and without any further explanation or evidence-based reasoning for the changes promoted. The draft GMS also incorporates rules masquerading as criteria that far exceed its legal mandate, and in this format, the draft GMS is a pseudo-regional plan. For these reasons, it's recommended that the draft gravel management strategy should not be adopted and should instead be rejected.
Kia ora, Robert. Thank you. As you know, we've reached all that time. It would have been good to ask a few questions, but that's all good. Look forward to our staff's assessment of the matters you bring to us. Thank you. Cheers for that. Well, that's our submissions at this point, people. We're going to break for our lunch now, and then we'll come back for other submissions at 2:15 later in the day. Thank you.